One overdose, one broken home, one choice that made history. At 17, J.D. Vance stood alone in a small Ohio town that America had forgotten. A boy torn between the wreckage of a family shattered by addiction and the haunting silence of a future that seemed already lost. The sirens had faded, but their echoes stayed with him. That night, staring at the cracked walls of a house that could no longer hold hope, J.D. made a choice that would take him from despair to the halls of Congress, from being invisible to becoming the voice of millions who had no voice at all. What was that choice? And how did a kid at rock bottom rise to shake the very foundations of power? This is his story, a journey shaped by courage, grit, and redemption. While this telling blends imagination and fact, it is grounded in the truths lived by so many forgotten across America. Their struggles, their hopes, their moments of decision, all reflected here in spirit, if not in every detail. So ask yourself, in his place, would you have had the strength to act? Stay with us. This isn't just JD's story. It's the story of forgotten America, and it's worth every second of your time. The air inside that tiny house on Jackson Street was thick, so thick a boy could almost choke on it. J.D. Vance, just 8 years old, crouched low behind a couch so worn the stuffing bulged out of its seams like white, dirty clouds. His heart pounded so loud in his chest he was sure the man in the room could hear it. But the man wasn't listening. He was too busy yelling, too busy smashing a bottle, cheap whiskey, the kind that smelled like rotting fruit and gasoline, against the wall. The crash of glass filled the room, followed by a silence so sharp it hurt JD's ears. For a second, the boy didn't dare breathe. He stared at the floor, where splinters of brown glass glistened like jagged teeth. The sour stench of alcohol mixed with the smoke of a cigarette burning down between the boyfriend's fingers. That smoke snaked through the room like something alive, coiling toward JD's hiding place. If I stay small, JD thought, maybe no one will see me. His knees ached from crouching, but he didn't move. He knew the rules of nights like this. Stay quiet, stay invisible, and maybe the storm would pass. He could see his mother's legs in the kitchen doorway, bare feet planted wide apart, bracing herself. "Just go, please," she said, her voice cracked from hours of fighting. But her plea only made the man laugh, a sound cold and hollow. A siren wailed somewhere far off, faint at first, then louder. JD's ears pricked up. Was someone calling for help? Would someone come? Or would they, like so many, drive past Jackson Street without looking back? Outside, the wind rattled the loose pane in the window. The streetlights flickered over cracked sidewalks and weeds sprouting through pavement. Once, this town had been proud. JD had seen the old photographs on the diner wall. Men in work shirts standing tall outside the steel mill. Women with their hair curled, smiling on Main Street. But now, the mill was shut, Main Street was boarded up, and Jackson Street was where hope went to die. Another bottle crashed, this one against the front door. JD flinched, his small hands flying to cover his ears. He wanted to close his eyes, but he couldn't. He had to watch, to know where the danger was coming from. His mother took a step forward, her voice rising. "Leave! Now!" The man turned slowly, the way wolves do when they spot the weak. His shadow fell across the couch, and for a moment, JD was sure those angry eyes would land on him. "Please no," he begged inside his head. But then the man's gaze flicked away, toward the kitchen, toward JD's mother. JD felt something then, a mix of terror and fury. Why was this happening? Why did no one come to help? Why did the people who made promises at election time never drive down streets like his? His small fist clenched against the carpet, the smell of dust filling his nose. He thought of Mama's words she'd whispered to him once, when the house had been quiet and the night had seemed safe. "Nobody's coming to save us, boy. You save yourself." And yet tonight, he was frozen, just a boy behind a couch praying the world wouldn't notice him. Outside, the sirens faded again, moving away, as if the world had decided Jackson Street wasn't worth the trouble. But J.D. Vance would remember, and one day the world would hear about Jackson Street. And just as J.D. thought the world had turned its back on Jackson Street for good, The night cracked open with the sound of tires skidding to a stop outside. The boyfriend's head jerked toward the window, his sneer faltering. J.D. stayed frozen, breath caught in his throat, eyes wide, as the front door burst open and in strode Mama. Hair wild, nightgown twisted, fury burning in her eyes brighter than any streetlight. She held the old rifle the family kept above the fireplace, the wood worn smooth from years of Mama's hands. It wasn't just a gun. It was the line she drew, the promise she made every single day that no one would harm what was hers. The boyfriend took a step back, arms raised halfway in drunken confusion, but Mama didn't blink. The barrel pointed straight at his chest, unwavering. "This is my house," she spat, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through whiskey haze. "You don't smash my walls. You don't scare my boy. And you sure as hell don't lay another finger on my daughter." J.D. watched from behind the couch, his body still trembling, but something inside him shifted. This wasn't just a rescue. This was war declared. By a woman the world would have overlooked, dismissed as old, as poor, as nobody. But in that moment, she was a fortress, and J.D. saw it clear as day. Sometimes protection didn't look gentle. Sometimes it came with fire in its eyes and steel in its hands. The boyfriend stammered, words slurred, trying to weigh his odds, but Mama cocked the rifle with a sound that seemed to freeze the whole room. J.D. could almost feel the air change, thick with a new kind of fear, not his this time, but the man's. Slowly the boyfriend backed toward the door, muttering curses that fell flat in the charged silence. And then he was gone, stumbling into the night, swallowed by the same darkness that so often swallowed their hope. Mama didn't lower the rifle right away. Her eyes swept the room like a storm, daring any other demon of the night to cross her line. Only when the quiet stretched long and sure did she exhale, shoulders sagging, the fire in her gaze softening as she turned toward J.D.'s mother. "You're safe now," she said gruffly, though there was a tenderness hidden in the grit of her voice. J.D. felt his body uncoil, the terror ebbing, replaced by something else, awe. He rose from behind the couch, legs unsteady, and met Mama's gaze for the first time that night. She winked just once, and in that small gesture, J.D. understood. Love didn't always come in soft words or gentle hands. Sometimes love roared, sometimes it fought, and sometimes it carried an old rifle like it knew how to use it. The house still smelled of whiskey and smoke. The glass still glinted sharp on the floor. But as Mama stood guard by the door, J.D. felt for the first time in a long time that maybe this broken house on Jackson Street still had walls worth protecting. Maybe, just maybe, it still had a chance. And so the night held its breath, and J.D.'s story, their story, kept moving forward, carried by the weight of an oath that would never be broken. The sun rose slow and heavy the next morning, casting pale light over Jackson Street as if the night's shadows hadn't quite let go. J.D. sat at the kitchen table, staring at the crack in his bowl of cereal, trying not to think about the glass that still crunched underfoot, or the rifle leaning against the wall, where Mama had left it. His mother hadn't come out of her room. The house was quiet now, but not the kind of quiet that felt safe. It was the quiet that followed storms, when you didn't yet know if another was on its way. When J.D. stepped off the bus at school, his shoulders hunched without him thinking about it. The building loomed like a place meant for other kids, kids who slept through the night, who had clean shirts that didn't smell like cigarette smoke, whose shoes didn't have the sole peeling away at the front. Inside, the hallway buzzed with voices, but J.D. felt as if he moved through it unseen, until the snickers started. "Nice shirt, Vance," a boy called from behind, loud enough for others to hear. J.D. didn't look back. The shirt had been his cousin's once, too big at the shoulders and faded at the seams, but it was what he had. He kept his eyes forward, his feet moving, as if he could walk fast enough to leave Jackson Street and everything that came with it behind. By the time he reached his desk, his stomach ached, not from hunger, though there was that too, but from the knot of shame he couldn't untie. The teacher, Mrs. Miller, stood at the front of the room, her hair neat, her smile tight. "J.D., where's your homework?" she asked, her voice polite but tired, as if she'd already given up on getting the right answer. J.D. swallowed hard. He could hear again the sound of the bottle breaking, the rifle cocking, his mother's cracked voice. The paper had been in his backpack, but he hadn't written a word. He couldn't, not with that noise in his head. But he couldn't say that. He couldn't let the class know. So he forced his voice steady and said, "I forgot." Mrs. Miller sighed, moved on, and JD felt both relief and disappointment swirl inside him. Another chance wasted, another mark against him. He slouched in his seat as she began the lesson, pulling down the old civics chart that showed how government worked. 3 branches, checks and balances, rights and responsibilities. As she spoke, JD stared at the chart, at the neat arrows and tidy boxes. But all he could think was how those boxes didn't seem to point anywhere near Jackson Street. Nobody in D.C. remembers kids like me, he thought. They made promises on TV, sent letters during campaigns, smiled from behind podiums. But the nights stayed the same. The yelling, the silence after, the sirens that kept on driving. JD's fingers traced a chip in the desk's surface, his mind half in that room, half back home. He wondered if Mama had locked the door this morning. He wondered if his mother was awake yet. He wondered what it would take for someone in one of those boxes on the chart to notice the boy sitting behind the tattered couch. The boy walking the halls of this school like a ghost. But no one noticed. Not here. Not there. JD clenched his jaw, pushed down the ache, and told himself to get through the day. Just get through. The world might have forgotten Jackson Street, but he would remember, and someday they would have to see him. The civics chart stayed in JD's mind all the way home that afternoon, its clean lines and perfect arrows haunting him, like a map that showed the way out. But only for other people. He stepped off the bus onto Jackson Street, where the lines weren't clean at all, where arrows pointed nowhere. He walked slower than usual, not ready to face the quiet of the house, the heavy air that still hadn't cleared since the night Mama stood with the rifle. But as he turned the corner, he froze. A car he hadn't seen in years, dusty blue with one headlight out, sat crooked at the curb. JD's pulse quickened, not in fear this time, but in a strange, nervous hope that felt too fragile to name. The door of the house stood open, and inside he heard the deep, familiar voice that belonged to a man he hadn't stopped thinking about, no matter how hard he tried. His father. JD stepped inside, clutching his backpack, heart thudding. There he was, tall, jeans a little too loose, hair longer than JD remembered, but the same quick grin when their eyes met. "Hey, buddy," his dad said, spreading his arms like no time had passed at all. For a moment, JD melted into that embrace, breathing in the scent of aftershave, of cigarettes, of a memory he'd carried like a photo in his pocket. His father pulled back, ruffled JD's hair. "How about we get some ice cream? Just you and me, like old times." JD nodded fast, too fast, afraid to break whatever magic had brought this man back to Jackson Street. He dropped his backpack, ready to go, but before they made it out the door, the arguing started. It began with his mother's voice from the hallway, tired, sharp. "What do you want showing up like this?" His father's grin faded. Words flew between them, low at first, then louder, until ice cream was forgotten, and JD found himself shrinking into a corner, watching the man he'd dreamed of become just another storm in the house. "I'm trying," his father barked. "But how's a man supposed to get ahead with the government robbing him blind? You think D.C. cares about guys like me? About us?" JD watched, and the knot in his chest tightening. The words didn't match the promise of ice cream. They didn't match the man in his memories. His father's voice was all fire and fury, but the heat burned everything it touched. In the end, his father stormed out, the door slamming so hard the window rattled in its frame. JD stood there long after the car's engine faded down the street, fists clenched at his sides. The hope he'd carried, so bright for those few minutes, flickered and died, replaced by an anger he didn't know where to put. He thought of the civics chart again, those branches of government, those neat boxes, and for the first time, he wondered if his father was right. Did the people in those boxes really care? Or were they just more arrows pointing away from Jackson Street, from kids like him, from promises broken as easily as the front door had slammed? The house was quiet again, But this time JD didn't feel safe in it. He felt hollow. And as he picked up his backpack, he told himself not to believe so easily next time. Because the world might not care, but he would. And one day someone would have to answer for the promises they made to kids like him. The door had barely stopped trembling from his father's exit when night settled heavy over the house, bringing with it a fresh storm JD hadn't seen coming. He sat at the kitchen table, the dim light flickering above him, trying to finish the homework he hadn't dared admit he hadn't done. But the sound of shouting outside pulled him to the window, heart sinking at what he already guessed he'd see. His mother stood in the yard, barefoot in the gravel, screaming at two uniformed officers who tried, with tired eyes and patient hands, to calm her down. It was an argument that made no sense, a mess of old grudges, slurred words, and hurt that JD couldn't untangle. When they finally guided her into the back of the cruiser, she kicked the door, her voice cracking the night as she yelled for them to let her go. JD just stood there, small and silent, watching as the taillights disappeared down Jackson Street. The front door creaked open behind him, and there was Mama. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She just placed one rough hand on his shoulder and steered him back inside. "Come on, boy," she said, voice steady as the rifle she'd used to draw lines no one dared cross. Later, JD lay curled on the couch under one of Mama's old quilts, the smell of her cigarettes mingling with the faded scent of laundry soap. The TV glowed in the corner, playing one of those late-night political debates that Mama liked to leave on for background noise. JD watched out of the corner of his eye as men in suits argued, faces tight with importance, voices raised but hollow. Taxes, trade, some bill no one in this house would ever see the benefit of. "Do they ever talk about places like this?" JD asked quietly, almost to himself. Mama didn't answer right away. She lit another cigarette, took a long drag, and blew the smoke toward the ceiling as if it might carry her thoughts somewhere better. Then she looked at him, eyes sharp despite the tired lines on her face. "You want out of this," she said, her voice low but fierce. "You fight every damn day like it's war, because nobody's coming to save you, JD. Not them on the TV, not anybody. You got that?" JD nodded, though the knot in his chest tightened. The debate raged on the screen, men pointing fingers, trading blame, none of it touching Jackson Street. JD watched, the seeds of cynicism taking root, and alongside it, a spark of something else, a yearning, a question that burned deeper than anger. What would it take to make them care? Outside, the sirens had faded, the street was quiet again, but JD didn't feel any safer than he had the night before. He felt older somehow, as if the world had forced him to understand things too soon. The couch creaked as Mama settled into her chair, rifle propped within arm's reach, the weight of her unwritten code filling the room as surely as the smoke from her cigarette. And as the voices on the TV droned on, JD stared at the screen, at the faces that would never know Jackson Street, and silently promised himself, one day, they will. The voices on the TV had faded into the low hum of static by the time JD slipped into his room that night. But Mama's words stayed with him, louder than any political debate, more lasting than any promise a man in a suit could make. "You fight every damn day like it's war." The words echoed in his mind as he closed the door behind him, sealing himself in his small world. A world that was his, if only on paper. The walls of JD's room weren't covered in posters of baseball players or rock bands like the other boys at school. Instead, maps lined every inch, their edges curling from thumbtacks that had been reused too many times. Some maps were of the country, big, colorful, with highways marked out like veins running to places JD could only imagine. Others were printouts from the library, black and white, blurry at the edges, addresses and directions to Marine recruitment offices in every state he'd ever heard of. By the weak light of the street lamp outside, JD traced the lines with his finger. From Middletown to Cleveland, from there to Pittsburgh, farther still to cities whose names tasted strange in his mouth. Raleigh, Jacksonville, San Diego. Each arrow, each route was a promise he whispered to himself at night. One day I'll follow one of these roads, and I'll be somebody. But for now, he was still here, still on Jackson Street, in a town that seemed to be falling apart one brick at a time. From his window, he could see the outline of the old steel mill, its smokestacks dark and cold, like chimneys from a house no one lived in anymore. The factories that had once roared with life were silent now, windows shattered, doors chained shut. Main Street was a row of boarded shops, the paint on the signs peeled and faded, the letters barely readable. Even the gas station on the corner had closed, its pumps rusted over, weeds pushing up through the cracks in the concrete, like nature trying to reclaim what people had given up on. Sometimes JD would stare out at it all and try to remember the stories Mama told of what Middletown used to be. A place where folks worked hard and came home tired but proud, where Friday nights meant packed diners and jukeboxes playing loud, where no one ever locked their doors because they didn't need to. It was hard to believe those stories now, harder still to see any future for a boy like him in a place like this. And so, he mapped his way out. Each pin on his wall, each line drawn in pencil was a tiny act of rebellion, a plan for escape that no one else knew about. He didn't tell Mama, not even her. This was his dream, too delicate to share, too important to risk breaking with words. He lay back on his bed, eyes tracing the lines on the ceiling where the plaster had cracked, imagining they were more roads, more routes leading anywhere but here. And as he drifted towards sleep, one thought stayed with him. Maybe the people on TV didn't care. Maybe nobody was coming. But the maps on his wall, they were his arrows. And one day he'd follow them. The maps on JD's wall had become his nightly escape, his silent promise to himself. Each line drawn, each route imagined, was a way to push back at the walls closing in around him. But all the lines in the world couldn't stop what happened next. And as dawn broke gray and heavy over Jackson Street, JD learned just how thin the line between dreaming of escape and needing it could be. It was the quiet that woke him, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel right, that hums with something wrong beneath the surface. JD padded barefoot down the hall, the floorboards cold under his feet, and pushed open his mother's door. The room smelled of sweat and stale air, curtains drawn tight against the morning. For a moment he thought she was asleep, curled on the edge of the mattress, one arm dangling toward the floor. But the stillness of her breathing, or the lack of it, froze him where he stood. "Mama?" His voice cracked as he stepped closer. He touched her shoulder, shook her gently, then harder. No response. Her skin felt clammy, too pale, too still. The world narrowed to the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He ran to the phone, hands shaking, fingers fumbling the numbers. 911, what's your emergency? Came the voice on the other end, calm, practiced. JD's own voice sounded far away as he told them, as he tried to explain. She's not waking up. Please, just come. The sirens came fast, but not fast enough. Their wail cut through the morning like a blade, growing louder, filling every crack of the broken house. JD stood on the porch as the ambulance pulled up, red and white lights flashing against the cracked windows, painting the walls inside with fleeting colors like stained glass in some church that had long since lost its congregation. Neighbors appeared at their doors, drawn by the noise, faces half hidden behind curtains, eyes wide with the kind of curiosity that pretends to be concern. JD felt their stares like heat on his skin, felt the shame rise inside him until it burned his throat. He wanted to shout at them, to tell them to look away, to mind their own damn business. But he didn't. He just stood there, fists clenched at his sides as the paramedics rushed past him into the house. From inside came the muffled sounds of orders given, equipment unpacked, the steady beep of machines JD didn't know the names of. And through it all, the same thought pounded in his head over and over. I'm done being their pity. I'm done letting them see me like this. The paramedics carried his mother out on the stretcher, oxygen mask over her face, an IV line trailing like a tether she might not be able to hold on to. JD followed as far as the porch, watched as they loaded her into the back of the ambulance. The door slammed shut, the sirens rose again, and the vehicle sped off, leaving JD standing there alone, the street suddenly too quiet once more. The neighbors still watched, but JD didn't meet their eyes. Instead, he turned and went back inside, shutting the door behind him with a force that rattled the loose glass in its frame. And as he stood in the hollow silence, the maps on his wall seemed to glow in the early light, their lines and arrows calling to him louder than any siren ever could. He stared at them, jaw tight, heart hard. Because now it wasn't just about dreaming of leaving. Now it was about survival. And J.D. Vance was done waiting for rescue. The sirens had long faded, the neighbors had gone back to their lives, and Jackson Street had returned to its usual silence. But inside J.D., the noise hadn't stopped. It echoed in the hollow places, in the cracks left behind by too many broken nights. The maps on his wall were no longer just dreams. They were blueprints. And it wasn't a matter of if he would leave, only when. So at 17, with hands that trembled, but with a heart that finally felt sure, J.D. Vance pushed open the door of the Marine recruitment office. The glass rattled in its frame, the little bell above giving a soft, uncertain ring that reminded him of the door to the gas station his town had lost. The place smelled faintly of coffee, old carpet, and something sharper. Maybe hope, maybe fear. The recruiter looked up from his desk, a man in uniform with sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms tanned and marked by sun and time. He didn't smile right away. He just studied J.D. as if he could see straight through the thrift store jacket, the too small shoes, the weight J.D. carried that had nothing to do with his pack on the floor. "First time in?" the man asked, voice low, steady. J.D. nodded, too dry in the throat to answer. The recruiter rose, came around the desk, and offered his hand. J.D. took it, feeling the firm grip, the kind that made you want to stand straighter, be stronger. "You don't have to be who they think you are, son," the recruiter said, not unkind, not with pity, just fact. As if J.D.'s whole story had been written on his face, in the set of his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. As if the man understood what J.D. hadn't even said out loud. J.D. swallowed hard, managed to find his voice. "I want out. I want to be somebody." The recruiter nodded once. "Then let's see where we can take you." They sat at the desk, papers spread between them, the recruiter explaining terms, options, duties. J.D. barely heard it. His mind raced ahead, picturing the roads he'd mapped, the cities whose names he'd whispered in the dark. His hands shook as he took the pen, the weight of it heavier than it looked. The tip touched the page, and the sound of it scratching across the paper was like thunder in J.D.'s ears. The sound of a door opening, of a chain breaking. He wrote his name in full, careful letters, as if this was the first time his name had truly meant something. When it was done, the recruiter clapped him on the back, and J.D. felt it. The beginning. The air seemed clearer as he stepped back out into the sun, the street the same but different, because now he wasn't just a kid behind a couch or a boy staring at maps. He was someone who had acted, someone who had chosen, and as he walked home, the lines on his maps felt closer, the arrows more real. Jackson Street still bore its scars, boarded windows, sagging porches, empty factories, but J.D. didn't look at them the same, because now he had a way out, and no one could take that from him. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a soft, pale light over the quiet streets of Middletown, when J.D. slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and stepped out onto the porch for the last time. The air smelled of dew and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked at the coming day. The town felt suspended in that moment, as if it was holding its breath, as if even the sagging houses and broken sidewalks knew this morning was different. The night before had been a blur, Mama making him a sandwich he barely touched, her hands working in silence, as if the act of feeding him could make the leaving easier. The maps that had lined his walls now lay rolled and packed, their arrows no longer just lines on paper, but promises he was finally keeping. Now standing on the porch, J.D. took it all in. The cracked steps beneath his boots, the paint peeling from the doorframe, the way the porch light flickered weakly, refusing to give up even as morning chased away the dark. He thought about how many nights he'd sat on these steps, staring out at Jackson Street, wishing for this very day. And yet, now that it had come, his chest felt tight, his throat thick. The bus appeared at the corner, tires hissing on the damp road, engine growling in the stillness. J.D. straightened his back, adjusted the strap of his bag, and turned to see Mama standing behind him, arms crossed tight, eyes shining with tears she wouldn't let fall. Not yet. "You be good, boy," she said, her voice rough but steady. "You keep your head on straight, and don't you forget where you come from." J.D. nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. He stepped off the porch, boots crunching on the gravel, and walked toward the bus, feeling the weight of every step. He climbed aboard, found a seat by the window, and set his bag on the floor. As the driver pulled away, J.D. pressed his palm to the glass and looked back. Mama stood at the edge of the yard, smaller somehow in the growing light, but fierce and proud all the same. She raised one hand, a wave that was part farewell, part blessing, part unspoken promise that she'd be here when he came home. J.D. watched until the house blurred at the edges of his vision, cracked, sagging, tired, but behind him now. The bus rolled past the empty factories, past the boarded shops on Main Street, past the gas station that had long since gone dark. J.D. stared out at it all, the streets he'd known his whole life, the streets he was finally leaving. He felt the fear that always comes with change, the ache of what he was leaving behind, but also the first true flicker of hope. And as Jackson Street faded into the distance, J.D. leaned his head against the window, closed his eyes, and whispered to himself the words he hadn't dared say until now. "I'm on my way." The hum of the bus engine that carried J.D. away from Jackson Street had long since been replaced by the roar of transport planes, the rumble of armored vehicles, and now, by the deafening crack of gunfire splitting the air over Fallujah. The dust hung thick, the midday sun doing little to burn it off, and every sound seemed sharper in this place, every breath harder won. J.D. crouched low behind a crumbled wall, heart pounding so loud in his ears, he wondered if the enemy could hear it too. It had started as a routine patrol, or so they thought, but the city had turned against them in the space of seconds, the silence broken by the staccato burst of AKs and the thunder of an RPG that sent debris raining down like hail. J.D.'s squad scattered, instincts taking over where thought left off. Now they were pinned, the street ahead a kill zone, the alley behind them no safer. A voice shouted, not in anger or fear, but in pain. J.D. whipped his head around and saw one of the newer guys, Ramirez, on the ground, leg twisted under him, blood dark and spreading in the dust. The others hadn't seen him fall. They were too busy returning fire, trying to find a way out. J.D. hesitated for half a breath, just long enough to taste the fear rising like bile at the back of his throat. Then he moved. He darted out from cover, the world narrowing to the wounded Marine, the bullets kicking up dirt at his boots, the shouts of his brothers in arms urging him to stay low. He reached Ramirez, grabbed him under the arms, and dragged him back inch by inch toward what little shelter the broken wall offered. The weight was nothing. Adrenaline made sure of that. But the distance felt endless. Every step was a prayer unspoken, every heartbeat a drumbeat in his ears. When they reached cover, J.D. dropped to his knees, chest heaving, and worked to stop the bleeding, hands slick with blood and sweat. Around them, the firefight raged on, but for that moment, J.D. could hear only his own breath, feel only the life beneath his hands and the fierce determination to keep it from slipping away. Later, much later, when the shooting had stopped, when the street was theirs again, when the medics had taken Ramirez and the dust began to settle, J.D. sat with his back to the wall, helmet in his lap, arms streaked with grime. He stared out at the ruined buildings, at the alleys where danger had hidden, at the sky that looked the same here as it did over Jackson Street. And he thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that in this place, no one asked where you came from. No one cared if your boots had once had holes, or if your house had sagged on its foundation. Here, it didn't matter if you'd been poor, if you'd been the boy behind the couch, or the kid with maps pinned to his wall. Here you were a Marine, and that was enough. J.D. ran a hand over his face, grit catching in the creases, and let the weight of that truth settle deep in his bones. Because here at last he wasn't invisible. Here he was exactly who he'd chosen to be. The dust of Fallujah still clung to J.D.'s boots, his uniform streaked with sweat and smoke, when the quiet finally came. That night, under a sky pricked with distant stars, He sat alone beside a sandbag wall, helmet at his side, rifle within reach. The adrenaline of the day had ebbed, leaving behind a deep, aching weariness and a mind that wouldn't settle. He pulled out a battered notebook and a pencil worn down to a nub, his link to a world far beyond these ruins, and began to write. "Mama," he scrawled at the top, the word steadier on paper than it felt in his chest. "I don't know if I can say this out loud, so I'm writing it instead. I'm becoming what you always wanted me to be. I don't know if I'm good at it yet, but I'm trying." The words came slow at first, but then faster, as if each one let him breathe a little easier. He told her about the squad, about Ramirez, about the way the world felt when everything else fell away, and it was just him, his brothers, and the mission. He didn't say how afraid he'd been. He didn't say how the fear still gripped him in the dark. But maybe she'd understand that part without him needing to write it. He paused, wiped at his face with a dusty sleeve, and stared out at the night. The city lay quiet now, but the silence felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. JD reached into his chest pocket and pulled out the small photo he kept there. Mama on the porch of the house on Jackson Street, rifle by her side, gaze steady beneath the weight of all she'd carried. The edges of the picture were worn soft from so many times he'd held it, a talisman against the things that tried to undo him. He stared at it now, tracing the outline of her face with a callous thumb. In her eyes, he saw the steel he tried to borrow every time he stepped into danger. When the noise started, when the world went red and loud and nothing made sense except survival, it was Mama's voice in his head, Mama's courage he leaned on. JD tucked the photo back into his pocket, close to his heart where it belonged, and finished the letter. "I don't know if this place will ever feel like home, but I'm doing what I said I would. I'm fighting. I'm standing up. Just like you taught me, and no matter where I go, I won't forget where I started." He folded the paper carefully, slid it into an envelope, and wrote her name on the front in block letters, as if that might help the words inside reach her faster. The mail would take weeks, maybe longer, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the promise inside. The promise that the boy who'd once hidden behind a couch on Jackson Street had found his way to his feet. As he sat back, listening to the soft murmurs of his squad bedding down for the night, JD felt the photo's familiar weight in his pocket and let it anchor him. Out here, far from home, it reminded him who he was fighting for, who he was becoming, and the vow he carried with him in every step. The photo of Mama had stayed close to JD's heart through the sandstorms of Fallujah, the endless patrols, the nights filled with more noise than sleep. Now it rested in his pocket as the bus rolled down the familiar cracked roads of Middletown, Ohio. The fields gave way to rows of tired houses, sagging fences, and broken sidewalks. The town he'd left behind welcomed him home with silence. JD stepped off the bus, duffel slung over his shoulder, boots worn but steady. The air smelled of cut grass, diesel, and the faint trace of factory soot that still clung to the edges of town like a ghost of what had been. He stood there a moment, just breathing it in, trying to bridge the space between the man who'd gone and the man who'd come back. Jackson Street looked the same, maybe even worse for the time that had passed. The house sagged a little more at the porch. The paint peeled deeper. The factories he'd once stared at through his bedroom window remained silent, their broken windows staring back at him like hollow eyes. Main Street's shops were still boarded, some with the same faded signs he'd seen before he left. Weeds pushed through every crack in the sidewalk, as if the earth itself had started to reclaim what people had abandoned. But there was something else too. As he walked home, duffel bouncing against his side, neighbors nodded at him. The same neighbors who once looked past him, who'd seen only the boy in the hand-me-down shirt, the kid with the cracked shoes. Their nods now carried weight, respect, recognition, maybe even gratitude. JD met their eyes, gave small nods in return, but inside he felt like a stranger. He was home, but home had changed. Or maybe he had. He couldn't tell which felt truer. The streets he'd known his whole life felt narrower, the houses smaller, the decay sharper. The town's wounds ran deeper than one Marine's return could heal. Mama stood on the porch when he turned the corner, arms crossed, chin lifted, eyes shining, even though she didn't shed a tear. JD dropped his bag at the bottom of the steps and climbed them two at a time, wrapping her in a hug that said everything neither of them would put into words. She held him tight, hard enough to remind him that no matter how far he'd gone, this was still where he belonged. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and the faint smoke of her cigarettes. It was the same, but JD felt different in it, bigger somehow, or maybe just older. He ran a hand along the worn wood of the banister, felt the grooves where his fingers had traced dreams of escape. Now he was back, and the town felt smaller, its weight heavier on his shoulders. That night, JD sat on the porch, watching the streetlights flicker to life, casting long shadows over cracked sidewalks. The quiet of Middletown wrapped around him, familiar and strange all at once. He thought of the men he'd served with, of Fallujah's dust, of promises made and kept. And as he stared out at the town that had shaped him, he understood. Some wars were fought abroad, but others waited at home, harder to see, harder to win. The porch light on Jackson Street still flickered in JD's mind as he stepped onto the campus of Ohio State. The sound of his boots crunching over gravel in Middletown seemed to echo faintly beneath the steady rhythm of students' footsteps on clean walkways, as if a part of him hadn't made the journey. The old duffel that had carried him through war now slung awkwardly over his shoulder, too rough and out of place against the sea of sleek backpacks and polished shoes that filled the quad. JD paused beneath a row of maple trees, their leaves just beginning to show the first hints of fall. The air smelled of cut grass, fresh paint on new buildings, and the faintest trace of coffee drifting from a nearby cart. He watched students pass in clusters, laughing, calling out to one another, the ease of their voices so different from the clipped commands and battle cries that still echoed in the back of his mind. He straightened his back instinctively, a habit the Corps had drilled into him. But even standing tall, he felt smaller here somehow, as if the uniform he no longer wore had been armor, and without it, every crack and scar was visible. He saw himself reflected in the polished glass of a building, jeans worn at the knees, jacket too plain, hair trimmed tight not by style but by habit. He looked like what he was, a Marine from nowhere trying to blend into a world that didn't even know where nowhere was. The faces that passed him looked polished, practiced. Young men and women with clean sneakers, crisp shirts, voices filled with confidence he didn't feel. JD caught fragments of their conversations, internships lined up for summer, study groups forming, plans for weekends that seemed to assume the world was wide open to them. It felt foreign. He thought of the maps he'd once tacked to his wall, the routes he'd dreamed of taking, and now that he'd followed one, he wondered if he'd crossed into a place he didn't belong. His first lecture hall felt like stepping onto another battlefield. Rows upon rows of seats, students already claiming spots with casual certainty, laptops open, screens glowing. JD slid into a chair near the back, his hand resting on the notebook he'd bought the night before. The paper felt too clean, the pen too light. He scanned the syllabus on the desk before him, the words blurring for a moment as he tried to steady the rush of doubt rising in his chest. "You've been through worse," he told himself, jaw tightening, shoulders squaring. "You've faced more than this. You can face this too." As the professor began to speak, JD forced himself to listen, to take notes, to push back against the voice that whispered he didn't belong. He kept his head down, focused on the words, the work. But part of him kept glancing sideways, seeing the confidence in his classmates' eyes, the ease in their posture, and wondering how long it would take to stop feeling like a stranger here too. When the lecture ended, JD stepped back out into the crisp afternoon air. The quad spread out before him, bright and busy, alive in a way that felt overwhelming. But as he adjusted his pack and took his first steps toward the next class, he reminded himself, every road starts with a step. You took the first one. Keep going. The campus quieted as the sun dipped below the horizon, the laughter and chatter of the day giving way to the soft hum of streetlights flickering on, the rustle of leaves skittering across walkways. For most students, night meant rest, parties, or study groups fueled by pizza and coffee. For JD, it meant clocking in. He traded his backpack for an apron behind the counter of a campus diner, where the smell of grease clung to his clothes no matter how hard he tried to shake it. He poured coffee, wiped tables, and scrubbed trays until his fingers ached, then hurried across town to stock shelves at a grocery store that stayed open long enough to catch the night owls and the desperate. The work was steady, the pay just enough, but the hours carved away at him like waves against rock. By the time he returned to his tiny apartment, one room, barely furnished, the walls bare where his maps had once hung, it was well past midnight. He'd drop his keys on the counter, change into the same worn t-shirt and jeans, and sit at the small chipped table that served as desk, dining spot, and sometimes pillow. A vending machine dinner sat beside his books, a crumpled bag of chips, a candy bar, sometimes a sandwich sealed in plastic that tasted of salt and chemicals. JD didn't care. Hunger was just another thing to push through, another reminder of why he was here. His notes spread before him, pages filled with scrawl that grew sloppier the later it got. Some nights the words blurred until he could hardly see them. Some nights he fought to keep his head from drooping, his chin from resting too long in his palm. The room smelled of paper, ink, and cold air leaking through the window frame, but it was quiet. A kind of quiet that let him think, or sometimes think too much. That was when the doubts crept in, the same ones that had whispered to him on the battlefield, that had stared back at him from cracked windows on Jackson Street. What are you doing here? You don't belong. They see through you. They hear the accent you try to hide. They see the thrift store close. He'd shake his head, force his focus back to the page, but the thoughts clung to him. He saw classmates' faces in his mind. Polished, confident, words smooth in class discussions where his felt heavy and slow. He remembered the recruiter's words. You don't have to be who they think you are. And he wondered, night after night, if that was really true. But alongside the doubt was something else. The same grit that had pulled him through basic training, through firefights, through sleepless nights in Fallujah. The same voice, Mama's voice, telling him, you fight every damn day like it's war. And so he fought, against the exhaustion, against the hunger, against the voice that said he wasn't enough. Outside, the city slept. Inside, JD worked on. The soft scratch of his pen, a small defiance against the dark. Each line of notes, each solved problem, each page read was another inch forward. And as the sky outside began to lighten, as the first birds stirred in the trees beyond his window, JD let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, he could win this battle too. The dawn that followed another long night at his small, scarred table brought with it no promise that anything would change. JD sat, shoulders heavy, eyes gritty from sleepless hours, spent chasing answers in textbooks and scratching out notes that sometimes blurred before him. Outside, the city stirred awake. Cars humming down the street, dogs barking in the distance, the smell of rain on concrete drifting through the cracked window. His apartment was silent except for the soft rustle of paper as he stacked his books, cleared a space on the table, and reached for the mail he dropped there the day before. Unopened, forgotten beneath the weight of work and study. A thin envelope with the Yale insignia peeked out from beneath a stack of flyers and bills. His heart jumped at the sight of it, but his fingers hesitated. For a long breath, he just stared, afraid to touch it, as if the simple act might change its contents. Finally, with a hand that trembled despite himself, JD picked it up. The paper felt heavier than it should, the embossed seal catching the light through the window. He turned it over once, twice, as if searching for some clue, some sign. Then slowly, carefully, he tore it open. The words inside were simple, formal, and yet they struck him like thunder. We are pleased to offer you admission. The rest blurred, and JD had to grip the table's edge to steady himself. His breath caught, and the tears came before he could stop them. Quiet at first, then harder, spilling down his face as he pressed a hand to his mouth to stifle the sob that rose unbidden. The apartment around him seemed to fall away. The cracked paint on the walls, the second-hand chair, the battered table. None of it mattered in that moment. The weight of years spent fighting battles no one else had seen lifted, if only slightly, and for the first time in a long while, JD let himself believe. I did it. His hand went instinctively to his pocket, pulling out the photo he carried still. Mama, standing on the porch of that house on Jackson Street, rifle by her side, gaze steady and unbreakable. He stared at it through his tears, then reached for the phone. His fingers flew over the numbers without thinking, the line crackling softly as it connected. Mama? His voice broke on the word, thick with emotion. Her voice came warm, if wary. JD, what's wrong, boy? Nothing's wrong, he said, the tears making him laugh even as they fell. I did it, Mama. I'm going to Yale. There was silence on the line, a silence filled with more than words could hold. Then came her breath, shaky but proud. I knew you would. I always knew. JD closed his eyes, letting the sound of her voice ground him, letting the moment settle deep inside him. The street outside still looked the same. The bills still waited on the table. The hunger of hard nights wouldn't vanish with one letter. But this was the road opening at last, the first arrow from his maps finally pointing somewhere real. And as he sat there in that small apartment, letter in hand, hope swelling in his chest, JD felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. He belonged on that road. He'd earned his way onto it, one long, hard step at a time. The letter from Yale had changed the course of JD's life, but it hadn't erased the weight he carried. The nights of hunger, the long shifts, the quiet battles no one saw. They still lived beneath his skin. And even after graduation, after the handshake that came with the law degree, after the move into a small apartment with clean walls and new furniture, JD felt it, the pull of the past, the parts of him that no diploma could paper over. That pull had brought him to this moment. The laptop glowed on the table before him, the screen a stark white rectangle, a blank page waiting to be filled. JD sat in a chair that felt too comfortable, in a room too quiet, and stared at the cursor blinking steadily at the top left corner. A small, steady reminder that time was passing and he had yet to type a single word. The idea of writing had sounded simple when the professor had first suggested it. Your story could help people. People like you once were. People who still are. JD had nodded, had agreed, had felt the truth in those words, but now faced with the task, with the empty screen, he felt only fear, because writing meant reliving. It meant stepping back into rooms filled with broken glass and whiskey fumes, nights of sirens and silence, mornings when the only thing heavier than the air was the shame that came with it. It meant remembering Jackson Street not as an idea, but as it really was. Cracked sidewalks, boarded windows, the smell of Mama's cigarettes blending with the scent of burnt coffee in the kitchen. His fingers hovered over the keys, hesitant, the words pressed at the back of his throat. But on the screen, nothing appeared. What if I can't do it, he thought. What if the story I tell isn't enough? What if the world doesn't care? He thought of Mama then, of the porch light flickering in the dark, of the rifle she'd held steady when the world had tried to break them. He thought of the recruiter's handshake, of Ramirez's weight as he dragged him to safety, of the quiet pride in Mama's voice when he told her about Yale. And he thought of all the kids still out there on streets like Jackson Street, kids who hadn't yet found their way out, kids waiting for someone to tell them it was possible. JD took a deep breath, placed his hands firmly on the keyboard, and let the first line come. Not perfect, not polished, but true. I was born to a family the world forgot. The words felt heavy as they appeared, but they felt right. The blank page wasn't blank anymore. The hardest step was done. He had begun. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passing, lights flickering on in windows. But inside that small apartment, a new journey had started. One not of escape this time, but of reckoning. One that would ask him to remember, to relive, to lay bare all that had shaped him so that maybe, just maybe, it could help someone else find their way. And as the cursor blinked at the end of that first sentence, JD squared his shoulders, ready at last to keep going. The first draft had been the hardest, forcing himself to go back, to see Jackson Street through the eyes of the boy he'd been, to name the things he'd tried so long to outrun. But line by line, page by page, JD had written it. And when the final chapter was done, when the last sentence settled on the screen, he'd lean back in his chair, exhausted and relieved, as if he'd fought another war, and somehow walked away standing. He thought the hard part was over. He hadn't understood yet that telling the story was just the beginning. The book hit shelves quietly at first, just a title among thousands, a voice small in the roar of louder ones. But then the reviews began, the interviews, the panels, and what had been a personal reckoning became something else entirely. A storm. Reporters called. Cameras turned their lenses toward him. Headlines branded him everything from a hero to a traitor, sometimes in the same breath. Some praised him for giving a voice to the forgotten, for daring to speak truths that made others uncomfortable. Others accused him of exploiting his own, of dressing up pain for profit, of confirming the worst suspicions of people who'd never set foot on streets like Jackson Street. JD watched it all unfold, equal parts astonished and numb. The media frenzy swirled around him, pulling his words apart, reassembling them in ways he didn't recognize. They debated his intentions, his loyalties, his right to speak at all. He became a symbol of resilience, of betrayal, of hope, of despair, depending on who was holding the microphone. Friends he hadn't heard from in years reached out, some with congratulations, some with thinly veiled accusations wrapped in polite words. Strangers sent letters, some filled with gratitude, others with fury. And through it all, JD stayed mostly silent. He'd said what he needed to say on the page. He'd bared his truth, with all its contradictions, its pain, its hope. The story was out there now. It would have to speak for itself. Some nights, alone in his apartment, JD would turn off the TV mid-debate, the sound of pundits arguing over his life too surreal to endure. He'd step out onto the balcony, let the city air fill his lungs, and stare at the lights stretching out below. And he'd think of Mama, of the porch on Jackson Street, of the way she'd face the world, steady, unflinching, letting actions speak louder than words. Let them talk, he'd tell himself. Let the book stand. Let the people it was meant for find it. And they did. In quiet corners of the country, in places forgotten by headlines, the letters came. Handwritten, unpolished, raw. From men and women who saw themselves in his pages, who'd lived the same nights, fought the same invisible battles. They wrote not to argue, but to thank him for naming what they hadn't known how to name. Those were the voices JD listened to, the ones that mattered, the ones that reminded him why he'd started at all. The storm of hillbilly elegy would rage on, praise and condemnation, spotlight and shadow. But JD stood where he always had, with both feet planted on the truth he'd told, come what may. The storm around hillbilly elegy never fully quieted, but in the spaces between headlines and debates, in the quiet hours when the cameras were off and the voices on TV faded to static, JD found something he hadn't expected. The letters kept coming, not from journalists or politicians, but from people like the ones he'd grown up with. People whose stories echoed his own in ways that made his chest ache and his hands clench with remembered resolve. They came from steel towns where the factories had long since gone dark, from farmhouses miles from the nearest grocery store, from city corners where hope felt like a luxury. The handwriting was messy sometimes, the grammar imperfect, but the message was always clear. We see you, you see us, don't stop now. Some letters said it plain. Run for us, be our voice, fight for us the way you fought for yourself. At first, JD pushed the idea aside. He'd already told his story. What more could he offer? But the words stayed with him, as persistent as the voice of Mama in his head. Every night, as he folded another letter and set it carefully in the growing stack on his desk, the idea took deeper root. He thought of the men in suits he'd watched on TV as a boy, arguing over policies that never seemed to touch Jackson Street. He thought of the promises made during campaigns, bright as fireworks and just as fleeting. He thought of the kids out there now, in towns just like his, waiting for someone to see them, to stand up, to make good on the promises that had been broken so many times before. And slowly what had felt impossible began to feel necessary. The decision didn't come in a single lightning moment, but in small, steady steps. The way a man makes up his mind to fight a war he didn't start, but can't walk away from. JD sat at his table late one night, city lights blinking outside the window, the letters spread before him like a map. His hand rested on the worn photo of Mama that had been his compass through every battle. "It's time," he said softly, the words surprising him with their certainty. Time to fight another kind of war. This war wouldn't be fought with rifles or in the dust of foreign streets. It would be fought in halls of power where voices like his were too often drowned out, where the struggles of places like Jackson Street were footnotes if they were mentioned at all. J.D. rose, the decision settling into his bones like the weight of the pack he'd carried as a Marine. Heavy but right. The path ahead would be hard. He knew that. The same forces that had tried to silence him before would try again. But he wasn't the boy behind the couch anymore, or the kid with maps pinned to his wall. He was ready. And as he stood there, alone in the quiet of his apartment, J.D. felt the same fire that had driven him to step onto that bus at dawn all those years ago. The same fire that had carried him through battlefields, lecture halls, and the storm of telling his truth. Now it would carry him into the next fight, not for escape, but for change. The Senate chamber was quieter than J.D. had imagined. The hum of whispers died down as he rose from his seat, notes in hand, though he hardly glanced at them. His heart pounded, but not from fear, from the weight of the moment, the knowledge of where this speech truly began. Not with his election, not even with his campaign, but long before in a small house on Jackson Street, where promises were broken nightly and hope was something you had to fight to keep. He drew a slow breath, steadying his voice. The chamber's marble walls seemed to lean in, listening. "I stand here today," J.D. began, "not as the son of privilege or the product of pedigree, but as a child of a town the world tried to forget. I stand here because of a woman with a rifle and a heart of iron who taught me that you fight every day like it's war if you want to survive. I stand here for Jackson Street, for Middletown, for every place like them." He spoke of Mama, of the nights she stood between him and harm, of the mornings she faced down despair with a cigarette in one hand and coffee in the other. He spoke of the factories that went silent, of the kids who watched their parents fade beneath the weight of broken promises. He spoke of his own mistakes, his own doubts, of the nights when hunger and hope wrestled inside him until dawn. And as his words filled the chamber, J.D.'s voice grew stronger, no longer trembling at the edges. He saw faces leaning in, listening, and he let the truth pour out. Not policy at first, not plans or points of order, but the story of what it meant to come from a place left behind, and why that must change. He closed his speech with the line that had lived in his heart long before he'd ever known he would speak it aloud. "A nation that forgets its poorest forgets itself." The chamber held its breath as his words settled, and in that stillness, J.D. felt the circle close, from Jackson Street to here, from forgotten to heard. The applause had faded. The cameras had turned away. The Capitol, grand and gleaming under the late afternoon sun, now felt quiet, its marble halls echoing with footsteps that were not his. J.D. sat alone in his office, the door closed against the noise of the world. On his desk stood a simple frame, the glass smudged from the times he'd picked it up without realizing. Inside, the photo he'd carried through everything. Mama, standing on the porch of that tired house, rifle in hand, gazed steady as the hills behind her. J.D. reached out, lifted it, and for a long moment just looked at it. "I kept my promise," he whispered. His voice was soft, but the words felt as solid as the stone beneath the Capitol dome. He had made it here. He had spoken not for himself, but for those who had never been heard, for the towns like his where hope came hard and stayed harder. He set the photo down gently, his thumb brushing the edge of the frame as if to steady it. Outside the window, the city spread out, not so different from the view of cracked sidewalks and empty factories that had shaped him, just dressed in grander clothes. The Capitol no longer felt like a place of marble and myth. It felt personal, human, a place where one voice could still matter. J.D. leaned back, let the weight of the day settle, but not for long, because the speech was only the beginning. The real work, the hard, thankless, necessary work, started now. Later that evening, as J.D. crossed the chamber again, gathering his papers, his eyes lifted to the gallery above. The visitors' seats were mostly empty now, the crowds gone, the excitement dimmed. But one figure remained. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, sat perched on the edge of his seat, legs swinging above the polished floor. He wore a jacket a size too big, sleeves frayed at the cuffs, the kind of hand-me-down JD knew all too well. His face was upturned, watching JD with wide, unblinking eyes. Not with awe, but with a kind of fierce, silent hope that made JD's throat tighten. For a breath, JD stood frozen, the weight of the day, the years, the promise he'd carried suddenly distilled into this one moment, this one gaze. He met the boy's eyes, and in them he saw himself. The kid behind the couch, the kid with maps tacked to the wall, the kid who once thought no one would ever see him. And then the boy smiled. Just a small, quick thing, uncertain at the edges, but real. JD felt the corners of his own mouth lift in answer. He raised his hand, a brief, quiet salute that was part greeting, part promise passed down. "Your turn," JD said softly, more to himself than to the boy, but certain the meaning would carry. The boy nodded once, as if he understood, and JD turned back toward his desk, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the chamber like a drumbeat of what was still to come. The work was waiting. The fight would go on. And now it wasn't just about remembering the forgotten. It was about lighting a path so the next voice, the next kid who thought the world didn't see him, could rise and speak, and be heard. J.D. Vance's journey reminds us that true strength is often forged in quiet, unseen battles. From a boy hidden behind a tattered couch to a man standing in the halls of power, J.D.'s story is not about perfection, it's about perseverance. He didn't erase where he came from. He carried it with him, using it as fuel to fight for those still waiting to be heard. His path shows that change begins when we choose not to stay silent, even when the world tells us we should. J.D.'s courage to face his past, to speak for the forgotten, and to lead with purpose is a powerful reminder that no voice is too small to matter. What part of J.D.'s story speaks to you the most? The fight to escape or the decision to return and serve? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to J.D. Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching J.D. Stories.